Hi, I'm Cheryl Kagan, very proud to be the senator for Gaithersburg and Rockville, and very proud to be the vice chair of the Education, Health, and Environmental Affairs Committee in the Senate. With me today is my chairman, Paul Pinsky. Senator Pinsky, Paul, thank you so much for taking the time to kibitz today.
It's my pleasure to join you today.
Thank you. So I have so much I want to chat with you about, but let's start with your background as an educator. When did you know that you wanted to be a teacher, and tell me how that was for you as the beginning of your career?
Well, I didn't grow up wanting to be a teacher or a legislator, to be honest with you, Cheryl. After college, where I was fairly active and possibly a couple of arrests for nonviolent protest, I wasn't sure what I wanted to do. I was interested in public policy. Eventually, when I wasn't sure, I decided to teach. And I started teaching in Prince George's County, a working class community where I thought it would be right for organizing. And I taught high school history. And I taught there for 19 years and was president of the teachers union there. And from there, I actually went to Montgomery County to work on the staff of the Montgomery County Education Association. And from there, I went to a regional public policy group out of Atlanta, giving technical assistance to a number of southern states, traveling to Mississippi, Oklahoma, South Carolina. So
amazing. So tell me what you learned in the classroom that helped you as an advocate or an organizer.
Well, I think I was an advocate before I was in the classroom for whatever purpose it was, whether it was against wars that the United States shouldn't have been involved in or supporting apartheid in South Africa. You know, it I think rooted me. The schools I taught in were working class, and in most cases, majority minority. And while I was a young person from New Jersey and thought I was going to teach these communities a lot, I think I learned more than I taught from understanding the communities and their history and their struggles.
Hmm. And you've indicated that some of those states had surprisingly progressive educational policies. Give us an example in Mississippi and Alabama and stuff.
Well, I have to say, coming from the DC area, DMV, yeah. I think our practices were pretty significantly advanced. Most of those states were underfunded. The state would allow the local school systems, which in many cases were 2 or 3 schools. They don't have large school systems like you do up north. In Maryland, for example, where the county and the school system are equated, they would have school systems of 3 schools or 4 schools, and the state would keep a hands-off policy. So they were under-resourced, underfunded, and sometimes having practices that dated back lots of years. So they weren't always following a progressive path.
Right. Talk about shifting from Prince George's County Public Schools to the Montgomery County Education Association. What surprised you?
That's a great question. Obviously, depending on where you are in Montgomery County, whether you're in the W schools on the west side of the county in Potomac, or you're in the eastern side, Einstein, Sherwood, that area, which has obviously a large Latino and a growing African-American population, you know, the cultural differences were pretty vast. You know, unfortunately, in Prince George's or Montgomery or across the nation, schools are segregated. You know, by and large, most schools around the country are one-race schools. They're either overwhelmingly white or they're overwhelmingly Black or Latino, for that matter. Mm-hmm. And there are not a lot of schools that have some kind of, I hate to call it a healthier mix, but a mix of race or class. And I think that's unfortunate because that reflects housing, which is also segregated.
Right.
And also, if you add to it, employment. So, you know, I have had some experiences where schools were very diverse with what I would consider a fairly balanced mix where no one was feeling the minority or the alienated or the voiceless. When I first went to Fairmount Heights, my first teaching assignment in mid-70s, late 70s, it was a few years after busing. So you actually had a situation where a lot of white working class young people were being bused into historically African-American school.
Mhm.
And were there tensions? Of course there were. But I think if you ask those students who attended, who are now in their 50s,
Mhm.
they said it was a great education. We had a great young staff, idealistic staff. These young people interacted with people of different races and classes, although most were working class at that point. It wasn't like we had a lot of wealthy folks.
Right.
It's sort of in central Prince George's County.
Right.
So it's unfortunate. I think people can learn when they're walking someone else's shoes or hearing from someone else, either because they are wealthier or poorer or they're a different race.
Right.
And sadly, that's not the case across the country and even across our state.
Right. So just to translate for folks who may not know, the W schools include Winston Churchill, my alma mater, as well as Whitman, our rival, and Wooten in my district, and others that are.
And Walter Johnson, yeah, primarily upper middle class, upper class, historically very white.
Right. So magnet schools have been expanding in Montgomery County and probably elsewhere, and that tends to really draw people and diversify the student body. Is that a good tactic in your view?
I think it has its place. I think to try to use whether it's a theme school or a magnet because of academic accomplishment or achievement, using that to bring people who normally wouldn't be in the same school building, I think it is clearly worthwhile. I've always been concerned that my light went out. I've been concerned about charter schools, particularly in their early 1.0, where they were skimming to try to get the same type of student. Now, we passed a law that prohibits that. Yep. But I think for a county to use magnet schools, I think it's a valuable tool that should be considered. Absolutely.
Right. Okay. So let's pivot to your first run for office. What made you decide to shift to the public sector and be a policymaker?
I think back to that very question and my response to it. When I was younger, in my early 20s, I eschewed electoral politics. I thought it was too status quo. I was more left-wing, wanting more than reform, but probably revolution. And that's why to this day, I'm a supporter of Bernie Sanders. But I was president of my teachers union local in Prince George's County, coming to an end of my term. And I wanted to be involved and have a voice. And it so happened that one of the state delegates who was running for re-election had been the author of the TRIM, which was a property tax limitation in Prince George's County that followed on the heels of Prop 13 in California. Mm-hmm. And by limiting tax revenue, you also limited investment in public schools and public safety.
Right. It
so happened this person was also anti-choice and had a few other things in his resume that didn't excite me. Mm-hmm. But it was a good time to build a coalition, a broad grassroots rainbow coalition situation. And I like to organize, and there are people around me who like the idea. And state legislature, as we know, is sort of I hate to call it the stepchild because that puts a bad name to stepchildren, but people either worry about their potholes in their neighborhood, which is local government, or because our proximity to Congress, the federal government. And the state is sort of forgotten, left behind. And in the DC area, unfortunately, because you've got federal governments, you have state governments, you have local governments, the coverage in the news media, whether it's print or TV, is very minimal. Mm-hmm. So people don't pay attention to it. Mm-hmm. I decided, why not? I can do things there. It's also manageable in terms of running a campaign. So I put together people pro-choice, pro-environment, pro-economic justice, diverse, and unions. And we just said, we're going to run. I was not tapped by the Democratic Party in our county, which is the predominant party. Mm-hmm. I ran against the Democratic Party from the left. Mm-hmm. We put a lot of people on the streets. I knocked on thousands of doors, and it turned out happily, and the first one is the one you always remember the most. Mm-hmm. Breaks the ice, and it was an exciting time.
Yeah.
And so in November of 86, I was elected and I took office in 1987.
It's fantastic and been here ever since. So
To some people's dismay, but yes.
So let's talk about education policy. Let's talk about the Kirwan Commission, named for Dr. Britt Kirwan, now called the Blueprint for America, for Maryland's future of our public schools. Why don't you talk about that? Because you were really a key member and an architect of really that enormously important legislation.
Well, look, I've spent a career in education. I've got over 40 plus years and I've worked in this committee which deals with education. So look, I'm not an expert. I don't have a PhD in education policy. I have been at different levels, teaching, organizing, representing teachers, giving technical assistance to other states. So I've acquired some knowledge. And I have to say, my years in Montgomery County, working with the then leaders of reforming education efforts on evaluation, on teacher quality, I gained a great deal of knowledge, and working with superintendents there, working with progressive union leaders, Mark Simon, a longtime friend of mine, Tom Israel, many, Bonnie Cullis, and numbers of people. So I learned a lot, I have to say, and I think some of the policies in place in Montgomery County are outstanding, and I think they're known nationally. That the union stands up for teacher quality and provides systemic support for teachers. But if after a certain period of time, people don't get it and they're not an asset but a liability, they are willing to say, it's a bad match and you shouldn't be in our school system. And I just think that is so laudatory that they're taking responsibility for quality education. And look, most teachers, virtually all teachers, want a good teacher down their hallway. They don't want a weak teacher. It doesn't make their job easier, it makes it harder. Mm-hmm. So I think, and a lot of the reforms came when they changed the evaluation system, and the leadership was great, and were willing to do things differently. So I think there are a lot of things that they brought in education consultants from the Boston area, Jonathan Safir, who does a great job, Research for Better Teaching. And so I learned a lot there myself. Anyway, I've tried to translate that into what are those best practices that could be translated to the state.
Yes.
And the Kirwan Commission, which met for 3 years and benchmarked international advanced countries and successful states, said, what are the best practices internationally and what would they look like in Maryland? And it took us 3 years to develop that vision.
So Governor Hogan vetoed our first bill, and we had to come back and kind of tweak parts of it. Why don't you talk about that briefly?
When we translated the Kirwan proposal into the Blueprint for Maryland's Future, as you mentioned, we passed a great bill. And the idea was that these are proven best practices, and that if the local 24 jurisdictions across the state wanted money, they were going to have to implement them with fidelity. Mm-hmm. They couldn't take the money and say, we'll do it our way. Well, in some cases, doing it their way doesn't work. The governor vetoed it, so it set us back a whole year. Mm-hmm. And then, just as we're coming back to override the veto, we're hit with COVID pandemic.
Yep. So
while we assumed students would be at a certain level, where we predicated all this, now they had a year and a half of disastrous situation where they were crushed. Students were crushed, teachers were crushed, parents were crushed. And there's been significant, whether you call it learning loss or lack of advancement. So where we hoped students would start from was not the same place a year and a half later. So we had to make up for that loss. So not only was it hard for us to implement what we wanted to implement, we had to add more money for tutoring and summer school just to get them to a better starting point. Mm-hmm. So, the timing couldn't have been worse, is all I can say. And I've talked to many teachers across the state, and I'm sure you have too. And this is, for many of them, even experienced teachers, been their hardest year. Yeah. They're just worn out. And I think after being home for a year and a half in front of a screen, reacclimating the students to learning in person,
Yes.
to being more accountable. And even for the teacher to get up and be in front of a class for 6.5 hours opposed to in front of a screen, it's been exhausting for everybody. And I think it's going to take much of this year to get us back to where we were. So all of our timelines have been set back, and it's very unfortunate for the kids in the state.
Yes. So before we leave Kerwin, tell me what you are proudest of that is in the law and what you are most disappointed that didn't get included.
Well, there are many parts to it. Increasing the number of scholarships to high-minded high school students who want to be teachers, who might not have become teachers.
Mhm.
We provide room, board, books for hundreds and hundreds, although it's still not enough. And particularly trying to recruit many teachers who look like the students in Baltimore City, Prince George's, at Einstein. So that's very important. We also set some new incentives. There's something called National Board Certification, National Teacher Standards Board, which I've been an advocate for 20 plus years. I started the program in the state. And it is a very high vetting to see if you're an outstanding teacher. About 50% actually achieve it. It's very hard. It's not quite like medical board certification. And if you achieve it based on Kerwin, on the new proposal, you will receive an extra $10,000 a year. And if you're in a high need school, a high poverty school, you get an additional $7,000. So that's $17,000. So we want to encourage these students to really strive even higher. And we don't want to have it as a niche program. We'd like it to be the expectation of all teachers. We want to improve the teaching quality. And there are other aspects. Community schools have health services provided in the school.
Yep.
Where there's more casework, there's better tutoring, having all students be able to read and maintain the reading level by grade 3. There's a lot in there. And as a package taken together, I think it fits together. It's used the lens of the students who need help the most. And as a former superintendent of Montgomery County always used to say, we want to raise the bar, but we want to close the gap. It's not one or the other. It's not just raising the bar and leaving people behind, or it's not just closing the gap and keeping people from exceeding. You want to do both. Right.
Gaithersburg High School is one of the schools in Montgomery County that has a school-based health center, and I recently toured it. And the telehealth bill that I sponsored that we was really important to make sure that that those kids are getting access, even during COVID, to important healthcare. Let's pivot to the environment. You are really the leader in the Senate on green related issues. And some of us may do stuff around the edges that is perfectly good and important, but you've been the guy who's been the big leader. So why don't you talk about the climate crisis and the bill you sponsored last year and are working on for this year, for 2022?
Well, thank you for the accolades, but I have to tell you, in some ways, my mentor, I have to give credit to Brian Frosch. Brian, now the Attorney General, who's got one more year, a friend of mine, and we served together in the House and the Senate, and he actually led many of the struggles. I was focusing on education, he was focusing on the environment, and he went to chair the judicial proceedings, so it fell on me. And while I was always a supporter, I had to become even more of an expert to fill his shoes. So I want to give credit to Brian for a lot of his work. Look, the environment is dangerous in many ways if it's not controlled and it's not cleaned up. Health, asthma, environmental contributions to things like cancer, as well as the threat of climate change itself. So we passed a bill, I guess, 10 years ago called the Healthy Air Act to make the coal-fired power plants clean up mercury and sulfur dioxide and a number of other things. And it was one of the most important bills in the country at that point, and I was proud of that. And then in 2009 passed, I guess, one of the first climate change bills in Eastern Mississippi. That is first time we had a reduction goal. It was 25%, way too low, but little did we know at that point. look, Al Gore was right, and he wasn't the first one to talk about climate change. There were scientists before him. He tried to popularize it, and he caught a lot of hell for it. But he was right, and so I've tried to do what I can to explain the urgency. A lot of people don't fear the urgency. It's a problem around the corner. And I used to use the example, if we had the bubonic plague and there were bodies strewn across the street in the United States in 2020 or 2021, we'd get on it. Now, we've had the COVID, where 800,000 people or nearly 800,000 people have died. And look, the private sector has gone into warp speed to come up with vaccinations and boosters. The same is not true with climate. I mean, even though it's affecting people in the urban areas, Black and brown people, flooding in Annapolis, in Baltimore City, businesses can't open their doors because there's flooding. Or even on the Eastern Shore, where farmers are losing farmland to what's called saltwater intrusion, where the salt water is coming up. But by and large, the populace doesn't feel the immediacy that it's a threat to them today or tomorrow. There's flooding, they have flooding basements. You've got the heat in Washington State and Oregon State last summer. I mean, there are examples all around us, but there's not the drive to get into the streets and say, we have to solve this today. So I'm trying to encourage that need for immediate, strong action.
So talk about your climate crisis, Bill.
Well, just like climate change is a multifaceted problem, I think the solution has to be multifaceted. And last year we passed the Climate Solutions Now Act in the Senate. The House wasn't ready to pass it, and I'm not going to go over why that happened. I'm looking forward and being a good senator and not pointing fingers because I want to be productive going forward. So I'm very optimistic that both the Senate and the House are on the same page this year. The bill does two things. It sets a climate reduction goal, 60% by 2030, and actually carbon neutral. I mean, so our carbon output is zero because even if it's plus, we have other savings. So by 2045. Now, we're in 2021. Can things change? Of course they can. But while having these umbrella goals, it also has many concrete actions because you got to hold people accountable. You got to be very specific with your requirements. And whether it's making the state fleet all electric or shifting our buses, which have exhaust in our communities, to electric, to having our building codes where they begin to rely on electric, which hopefully is produced by more wind, solar, and geothermal, rather than from coal or oil or even natural gas. So we change our building codes, that we pay strict attention to environmental justice. What kind of damage have we done in the poor communities, communities of color, and what kind of remedy and what kind of investment do we have to make? And also things like, how do we have a just transition? What about the people who are displaced? What about those workers, those unionized workers with decent salaries whose jobs dry up? We have to have a plan. We have to have the stakeholders at the table with a thoughtful plan where these families can pay their mortgage, can put money aside for college if the children want it. So we've got to have a plan for reemployment at a decent wage. So, there are many pieces to it, and our bill tries to include many of them, not all of them, but some of them.
So talk about what it's been like for the last 7 years to work with a Republican governor and a Republican administration and Secretary of the Environment, who generally I think means well, but I know, we've had our frustrations.
Yeah, most of my career has been working under Democratic governors, Schaefer, Glenn Benning, O'Malley. We had one Republican for 4 years, Bob Ehrlich. But even with Governor Ehrlich, you knew where he stood. You'd disagree, he'd say it, and you just lock horns. The last 7 years have been very different. Our governor has prided himself in being the anti-Trump, and he's gotten a lot of TV publicity for being the anti-Trump, the reasonable Republican.
Right.
And a lot of people see he came to office, he beat cancer, and I'm glad he's healthy. Although another thing he did when he came to office was to lower the tolls. he didn't tell people that while they would be pleased tomorrow and the next day, that there would be less money to repair the same bridges and roads 3 years later.
Mhm.
And I found over the last 7 years, he's basically pandered to people's baser instincts. Smaller government, smaller taxes, but there's no enforcement. There's been an article just came out about inspections of water pipes and water permits. We could have a Flint, Michigan, but people don't know about that. If he cuts the number of inspectors and enforcement, it's a hidden cost, but in the end, it's going to affect people's public health. And, they've essentially dragged their feet. He's taken credit for a lot of environmental successes, but it was not because of him, but in spite of him. He vetoed many of these bills, and then a year later, he'll say, look what we did.
Right.
The legislature did it over his objection. And unfortunately, even the key departments, Department of Environment, Department of Natural Resources, they'll go for low-hanging fruit. But if it means any issue that is controversial, they duck and run.
Right.
And some people are decent people in these administrations,
right,
but they're following policies that are harming our people.
Right. Before I pivot to something else, anything else on the environment that you want to mention?
No, I think we should use the environment as one of those key issues in the upcoming election next year to decide on candidates.
Yep.
Do people support addressing climate change in an aggressive way, or do they duck or dance or oppose it? And I think whether for governor or for local office, that should be a key wedge, one of the key wedge issues.
Right, right. So you were a vice chair, and then and now you're the chair. What do you like about chairing? What's the hardest thing about your job, and what do you like best?
Well, I guess I'm giving advice to my vice chair, who's in my position. Look, having staff, additional staff, to frame when we vote on what issues, hearing schedules, setting priorities, falls to the chair. And I have a good sense of this body. I have, I guess, accumulated a number of years of experience, and I feel, melding the idea of policy and politics is a fairly unique skill. And I think when you're chairman, if you have those skills, it actually helps move an agenda forward.
Mm-hmm.
And look, there are people in our legislature nationally. Look, my friend and a friend of yours, and one of my former colleagues, Chris Van Hollen, now U.S. Senator, was one of the best at being a policy wonk, but also understanding politics.
Right.
I mean, there are some of our colleagues that know policy but don't know politics, and there's some who like politics and door knock but have no clue about nuance of policy.
Right.
So I think having a chair who's got both those skills, and again, I don't mean to be blowing my own horn here. I feel good about that, and I have a extremely competent staff, and we have a great committee. I happen to have one. It's transformed over the last few years, and regardless of the party they come from, people are willing to roll up the sleeves and work hard, and particularly on non-ideological issues. I mean, on ideological issues, the Democrats and Republicans are going to fall where they are. But we have many issues where, it doesn't matter who contributes, we make a bill better, and everybody's willing to roll up their sleeves. And I respect our Republicans. I might disagree on pro-choice or economic inequality, but on a lot of the bills that come before our committee, unlike the federal government and Congress, we call on everybody, and everyone pitches in. And I think there is this comedy, and that's with the T, not a D, that people understand they're appreciated, and if there's a place for them to step in, they can. Yes.
I think we need to give a shout out to Jamie Raskin as well, our friend and former colleague and my congressman, for someone who is both the political person and the policy person. I think he's someone else who fits in that box. Gosh, still so many questions. Let's talk about your experience about during COVID and trying to keep our committee running and together, and what that's been like as a challenge.
Look, I think all of us, looking back years from now, will say, wow, that was a tough couple of years. And we don't know if it's 2 or 3 or however many years. Before last session, I had a meeting with the Senate president and the other chairman. It's called leadership sometimes. And we talked about protocols for how to handle committees. We took testimony virtually. We didn't have hundreds of people coming into our hearing rooms. But I said, even though we're going to work from our offices, when it comes to a voting session, I really want to have people in the hearing room. I want my committee members in the hearing room. I want to see when there's consensus, when someone's not happy. I like the 3-dimensional, reading someone's face, and maybe it goes back to teaching, seeing when the light switch goes off and it's an aha moment, or the frown. And so I like that, reading a room. We had plexiglass between our desks and we wore masks, but I wanted to run an efficient dialogue and voting session.
Yes.
Little did I know when I made that suggestion strongly, that our voting sessions last year, I thought, were super productive and very cordial. And we got a lot done. And I realized after the fact, that I think people appreciated because they were in the same room with other people. Everyone has wanted personal contact. We haven't had it for 2 years. And I think one of the reasons our voting sessions went so well, people wanted to be there and they were not very antagonistic, was they appreciated having the interaction, the dialogue. In a room, we had fans going, we had the plexiglass. And again, that was not my original drive for calling for that. And I think I heard good things from all the committees, that the voting sessions were very healthy, helpful, and productive.
Yes, yes. So we are both in our Annapolis Senate offices right now because the Senate is in special session with 3 agenda items: veto override, electing a new treasurer, and redistricting. Why don't you talk about redistricting, since you've done that before and you were on the commission?
I would love not to have to spend time on redistricting. It is never perfect, it is never right, and you're always receiving criticism. That goes with the territory.
Right.
There's legislation in front of Congress that would take it out of our hands for all 50 states. It would be nonpartisan, independent, based on certain criteria. But unfortunately, the Republicans have blocked that. They have continued to block it. Here's a case where all 50 states would do it. The legislators would be taken out of it.
Yep.
But they oppose it.
Yep. So to be clear, we're not supposed to be talking about redistricting in any specificity. And so when constituents or advocates contact us for legal reasons and stuff, we're not going any deeper than that. But I did, but if there's anything about the process, the hearing.
Yeah, but I think the key point is people from the very same party want us in Maryland to adopt an independent redistricting commission. But yet members of the same party don't want to adopt it for all 50 states. So essentially what it is cherry picking. They want to take it out of the hands of Democrats in those few states that have Democratic majorities, but they don't want to do it in the majority of the states that are controlled by Republicans.
Right.
And that's the hypocrisy of all of this. It really is. And we talk about unilateral disarmament, which was in the Cold War, who had more nuclear weapons, Russia or the United States. And you don't want to say, I'll take mine down and you keep yours up. Right. And that's basically the case here. I mean, why should the states that have the fewer abuses, you look at Texas, they're back in court for a 3rd time. Right. North Carolina, Florida, Pennsylvania. Some, the federal courts have gone in twice and said these maps stink.
Right.
And so we're in the minority and we're the ones who should say, let's give it to an independent party. while they won't do it on the national level. So I'd rather not be doing this. I'm sure the map will be criticized by Democrats and Republicans, but we're not going to say, here, take over our state.
Right, right, okay. So redistricting dictates elections. So I just want to talk briefly about 2022 for you. And you had a big summer internship program. Why don't you talk about that? You've been knocking on doors. Why don't you just chat just a little bit about this year, next year for you?
Well, you know, a number of people, including Congressman Raskin, have run democracy summers based on the old civil rights model in the 60s and 70s, where people would go down south to do voter registration. And we know many people lost their lives because of it. Young people, black, white, et cetera. Goodman, Cheney, you know, Schwerner, we know that is one example. And I've got friends who were on those buses. So we pulled together a program. We had a 20-hour program for 2 different weeks with about 25 young people from 17 to 23 to immerse them in what it means to be engaged in local politics, state politics. And we had mayors, we had state senators and delegates, we had former staffers in Congress. And we also had them knock on doors to find out what's on people's minds.
Just to be clear, the mayors and council members and legislators spoke to the group to do
Right.
a sort of tutorial educational aspect.
Right, and the groups are small enough that it was very interactive. I mean, I wanted them to see, touch, feel the experiences of these other local leaders from around the state and in Prince George's County, where I live.
Yes.
So, you know, it was very diverse, a lot of African Americans, Latino, Anglos in high school and colleges.
Mhm.
And after spending an hour or two hearing and having debate, discussion with people who are engaged and asking tough questions. These are smart kids, really smart kids. Then they would, you know, start knocking on doors and saying, want to make sure you're okay with COVID. How do you do? And what's on your mind?
Yes.
What's important to you? And they would document that and bring it back to me. And I'd be out there too. So it was, unfortunately, the first week, you know, every night was like 96 degrees. So, it was hot, and some might understand the word schwitzing.
Yeah.
So it was a great experience for me, and I think for them. We got pretty good response, and we did a second cohort. That was late July and early August, and it was exciting. And hopefully they got something from it. And look, all of them, you know, I asked them on the very first day to get up and say, why are you here?
Uh-huh.
And some of them were not going to immerse themselves in activist politics. One wanted to be an engineer, but they wanted to see how government worked.
Love it.
I mean, some I could tell want to be involved in public service.
Right.
Some don't. And that was not a defining criteria.
Right.
It was, they wanted to take 20 hours of their summer and to learn and be engaged.
But you know what? You change them, because even if they become an engineer, they will always have an awareness and a sensitivity of democracy, of being a change agent, of connecting in community, of learning and caring about issues. I mean, I think it's extraordinary. Good for you. Yeah. So, Paul Pinsky, fast five quick questions with quick answers to let people get to know a different aspect of you.
Uh-oh. I'm in trouble.
So question number 1, what is your favorite place to go for a meal or a drink or something in Annapolis?
Ooh, in Annapolis. Whew. I mean, it's not fancy, but it's nearby. You know, for lunch, I'll go to Ram's Head just because it's convenient. It's not fancy. I like the new place in Eastport occasionally for a meal. The small place that has pizza, the little house, 99. It's got a number to it. I can't remember. But as you know, I'm not the last one to close down a place on Monday night or Tuesday night in Annapolis. I'd rather be in my own house, making my own dinner, being in my own bed. So I'm not, I'm not the expert in the meals here in Annapolis.
Right. That's all right.
Sorry.
Yeah. Question 2. What is your favorite book? Something that has inspired or guided you in your life?
Ooh. Oh God, there's so many. I'm a pretty voracious reader. Fiction and nonfiction. Has there been a book that, I'll read books about W.E.B. Du Bois, Nelson Mandela. There's a great book, Heather McGhee, The Sum of Us, about race and class, that was out about a year or two ago, was a finalist National Book Award.
Yes.
And I love well-written fiction. I like mystery writers as well, and there are some great writers out there who I really enjoy.
Right. If you could travel anywhere in the world and neither money nor COVID nor time were an option, where would you want to go?
Whew. Well, I for sure want to go back to South Africa. That was one of the most transformative trips I ever took with my family. That was wonderful. I want to go to Australia when I have time. I don't want to have to travel. I'm 6'3" and being in a small seat. Post-COVID, I do want to get to Australia, and I have a niece who lives there.
Nice.
At one point, I thought of, going to wherever the Wimbledon, the French Open, the Australian Open were being played, and hit all of those countries and watch those matches.
So you know what? I'm going to do something I've never done before and interrupt my own Fast Five. The Chinese tennis star who has disappeared.
Peng Shui or...
So talk about what you think about the Olympics and the American tennis team or America and engaging with China because you are a ferocious tennis player, as folks.
Well, my interest exceeds my ability. Look, she called out a minister and she's gotten in trouble. Some people say she's fine. It's unclear if she is fine. I think for the Women's Tennis Association to say we're not going to play there, I think it's a smart move because it's revenue they'll lose.
Yeah.
I think she's got to be freed and be explicitly clear that she is working and living in her own volition and not being intimidated and swayed.
Yes.
The Beijing Olympics is another story. I think, some people say we should not send any teams there. That's a complicated issue. I mean, should sports supersede ideology? That's a long discussion.
Right. Which we are not going to have now. So going
Exactly.
now. Question number 4. Who is a shero or hero of yours, living or dead? And I'm guessing, I'm going to predict you're going to say like 5 people, not one. Which is
there are a lot of people who I look to. Look, I think Nelson Mandela was a great leader in terms of fighting the resistance. I mean, he was a militant. He believed in armed struggle, and he led a lot of the African National Congress from jail. And then he also was able to adjust and lead a reform government. So he adapted to the conditions, and he was a master strategist. I mean, obviously he was a symbol for the world,
yes.
But as a politician, tactician, and revolutionary, he understood the years, the times, what epoch he was in, and to change the strategy. So I think he was terrific. And obviously as an orator and a writer, W. Du Bois and people like him, Frederick Douglass in the same way. I mean, I've got a lot.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I knew you would. The last question, Senator Paul Pinsky, Chair Paul Pinsky, what is your secret hidden superpower? What is something you're really good at that most folks can't do?
Whew. Well, most of my contemporaries are not great at being fix-it people. And I've gotten much better at being a fix-it person. Putting on a new roof on a shed at age
X.
Turning off the electricity and taking out some fixtures and reconnecting them. I'm sure there are people out there who can do a hell of a lot more than I can. but of my contemporaries in ilk, who usually make a phone call,
Right.
have something done. I've gotten a heck of a lot better at doing a few things myself.
Well, good for you. Congratulations. Don't fall off a roof. Don't hurt yourself. We need you.
I think I'm done with that.
Okay. All right. Well, Paul Pinsky, thank you so much for kibitzing with me today. Thank you for your leadership for so long and the differences that you make every day in the state of Maryland. Good to see you. And I will see you just in a few moments, actually.
And thank you for what you do, Cheryl, both at home and here in Annapolis.
Thank you. Appreciate it.